Okay, we're going to begin this workshop on climate justice is social justice. I'm John Foran with the Transition Movement and longtime activist and scholar of the global climate justice movement. And it is my pleasure to bring this workshop to the summit and to all of you today. The premise of the title, of course, invokes the fact that we live in a multi-dimensional crisis these days that's kind of extraordinary when you take into account the climate crisis, the pandemic, the structures of racism and patriarchy that have persisted for many, many centuries, the economic inequality generated by our global capitalist economy, what some call the democracy deficit, the lack of inspiration that political parties everywhere offer to most voters, and the cultures of violence in which we live, from our most intimate relationships in the home through our communities, including police violence, all the way to the national level of foreign policy based on militarism. I don't know, I count 7 crises that are intersecting. And in that single way, it becomes evident that climate justice has to connect all those dots. And as an observer and participant in global climate justice spaces, it's been wonderful to see that emerge in the climate justice movement, and to see that movement be one of the ones that really does connect all the dots. And so we're here today to hear about climate justice being social justice, their relationship. We have 8 speakers in all today. It is a tremendous gathering of folks from 4 countries other than the US. Some of them are going to be recorded and presented to you, if all goes well, in video, because they're in places where it's like 2 a.m. in the morning, like in the UK. One of our speakers will join us at the hour mark from India, because it's very early there right now. And we have 5, if you will, live speakers. And the plan is to begin with our live speakers. We've agreed that each of our panelists will speak relatively brief remarks, but enough to develop some ideas for us around our theme. And with that, I'd like to begin. It's like a fishbowl with 4 folks and then a Q&A, then 4 more folks. And Michelle's here. We'll let Michelle settle in. She's technically the first presenter, but we can.
I'm also ready to go if you're comfortable.
Michelle. All right, then without further ado, Michelle Sevilla is going to kick this off. Michelle is a friend and colleague here in Santa Barbara County in the Central Coast Climate Justice Network, and I'll let her introduce herself to you.
Thank you, everyone. In my time, I'm in Pacific Standard Time, so it's 5:07. So therefore, magandang hapon. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Sevilla. My pronouns are she, they, and I wear many hats. Through a number of which John and I have collaborated very closely, as well as a number of our fellow speakers. But today I wear my hat as the first staff member of the Central Coast Climate Justice Network. As their first staff member, I am their network manager. And the Central Coast Climate Justice Network is a coalition of voting, participating network member organizations coming from different facets or different missions, from environmental conservation, preservation, all the way to and outreach and education, to social justice, to racial justice, organizations that work in multiple facets, from farm worker rights, immigrant rights, housing and tenants' rights, all coalescing but for Santa Barbara and Ventura counties in California, here on the West Coast of the United States, to have a more coordinated climate justice effort. I'm grateful that John Foran has invited me to speak, because John has also been a huge participant in the network on behalf of the UCSB Environmental Justice Climate Justice Hub, as well as various local jurisdictions, including the County of Santa Barbara, our ally organizations, to environmental nonprofits, and so on and so forth. Our goal, as almost 20 organizations have coalesced to have a more coordinated climate justice movement, is to one of our biggest goals and efforts right now is developing a local regional Green New Deal, one that is tailored to Santa Barbara County and Ventura County respectively. So there will be 2 separate reports, and thanks to the Green New Deal Committee collective, led by several UCSB scholars, including John and David Pello of the Environmental Studies Department, as well as One Step a la Vez, a youth group that serves the Fillmore and Santa Paula areas of Ventura County, that serves what the state likes to call disadvantaged communities, DACs, or more in terms of more empowering language, communities that are environmental justice communities and need to be first consulted when it comes to having a more equitable climate justice movement. And so in the first round of Santa Barbara County Green New Deal House meetings, which are a pretty apt time to talk about the Filipino American Heritage Month, because in September 8th or 6th of the 1966 year, number of the Filipino Manongs, including Larry Itliong and Philip Veracruz, started the Delano Grape Strike, which was the catalyst to the ag labor movement as we know it. And we don't hear about this beautiful intercultural solidarity and true coalescence of various immigrant workers, from the Filipinos to the Mexicans, who convene together to fight for ag labor movements. And so these house meetings that they conducted in the 60s, it rings true for us today, and continues to be extremely relevant as the Green New Deal Coalition and Central Coast Climate Justice organizations have these house meetings for at one point was for envisioning what a more just ag work setting looks like, set by the community for the community. We are doing the same in Santa Barbara and Ventura counties for a Green New Deal, for a climate-friendly future. And so over almost 400 unique constituents and neighbors and residents of Santa Barbara County came together and pulled together a beautiful vision for what it looks like to have a climate-friendly future, tapping into youth to elderly, talking about the vulnerable populations that need to be consulted first when we're doing this planning. And so, when we're talking about this webinar, that climate justice is really social justice, understanding the systems and the barriers in place that have continued to stifle Black, Indigenous, non-Black folks of color, and stifle their voices from positions of leadership in the environmental movement and into many powerful spaces here, not just in the United States, but it might be a shared experience in other countries, that we are now having a reckoning of the leaders who have been sorely missing from this movement for decades. An environmental movement that has been, an environmental justice movement is not a new movement. The phrase of tree huggers comes from several decades ago, where Indian women of the Chipko movement banded together and chained themselves to trees to protest the cutting down of important ecological forests, important to them and their cultures and their society. So, environmental justice is not a new thing, although it might be more, and grateful still, though, how much it has permeated through our more commonly used language, but certainly I'd like to say that the Central Coast Climate Justice Network is a true model, basing it off of a very horizontal and lateral structure that prioritizes BIPOC voices, putting leaders like myself as a queer, femme, immigrant person of color into positions of leadership where we could get paid to do this work, where we have often been volunteering our time and sacrificing a lot of time that could otherwise be spent earning wages to fight this good fight. So I just wanted to thank John again for inviting me to be one of your honored speakers, and very, very humbled to be among other fabulous speakers following myself.
Thanks, Michelle, for that kickoff, and congratulations on becoming the first general network manager of the CCCJN. I've popped the link to the CCCJN there, and when I find the announcement, or if you could even find the announcement, there's a great article that was recently sent out, a new press release about this appointment, and it's a big deal, and we're pretty happy about it. We're going to turn to Shante Davis. Shante comes from New Orleans and comes to us as a 17-year-old activist in the Sunrise Movement. And it is my pleasure to have gotten to know her and to now invite her to speak to us. Over to you, Shante.
Thank you, John. Do I have permission to share my screen? I've put together a presentation.
I think you do. Try it.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Oh, wow. Wait, I'll have to pause this for a minute. Seems as though I'm having some technical difficulties. Am I frozen?
No, we can hear you just fine, but the screen share might somehow be frozen in one of the mysteries of Zoom technology.
Okay, well, that's fine. Hi, everyone. My name is Shante Davis. As John mentioned, I'm 17 years old, and I am a lead organizer with the Sunrise Movement. If you don't know what the Sunrise Movement, it is a youth climate movement with members ranging from 35 and younger. And basically, we fight for a Green New Deal. So what is a Green New Deal, you ask? It would be a 100% clean and renewable energy by 2030, a job guarantee for every American who needs one, investments prioritizing frontline communities, an overhaul of our transportation infrastructure and agricultural systems in order to guarantee everyone clean air and healthy food to eat, and much more. The Green New Deal really encompasses the theme of climate justice is social justice because it looks at the intersections that come with the climate crisis. So like food security, environmental racism, jobs, infrastructure, our economy, and much more. So here at Sunrise, we like to think that climate change is not a single issue, and the Green New Deal will recognize and address the intersectionality of the climate crisis as it disproportionately impacts people with marginalized identities. This is a great quote about the Green New Deal. It says, a Green New Deal must be developed through transparent and inclusive consultation, collaboration, and partnership with frontline and vulnerable communities, labor unions, worker cooperatives, civil society groups, academia, and businesses. So it's fully encompassing. We have the power to make change, and we already are. What I am leaning towards here is something amazing that I was able to have the privilege to do this summer. Change is happening now. Climate justice is social justice. So this summer, as you can see, I have different pictures up. I organized a 400-mile march across the Gulf South from New Orleans to Houston to mimic and take agency over the path that many families had to take during Hurricane Katrina. along the way. So we started in New Orleans. We launched at the Superdome, which was a very historic location with Katrina, as many survivors had to evacuate there if they couldn't evacuate the city. From there, we walked to Cancer Alley, which is a frontline community that is being disproportionately affected by the oil and gas industry that has moved on their part of the river parish. And from there, we collaborated with Rise St. James, which is an environmental justice group who is trying to beat the Formosa plastics industry that's trying to move in. So we did a joint action with them to call on to Biden to revoke their permit, and as well as the Descendants Project, who we joined together to protest against the Wallace Grain Elevator, which is Descendants Project is a social justice organization where their the land that the grain elevator was going to be built on was actually the ancestral lands of they had descended from the slaves, which like a lot of the plantations line their St. John Parish, which is their, well, in any other place it would be called a county, but yeah, in Louisiana we call them parishes. From there we went to Cameron in Louisiana, and right here, this one, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but the top left corner with everyone sitting around, that was the Bayou Food Forest, where we talked about food security, and we propagated a few sweet potatoes and talked about how the climate crisis was making it worse to get healthy food to people in the city as well as rural areas in Louisiana. Soon after that, we made it to Lake Charles, where we did a bunch of things. We gutted and rebuilt homes that had been affected by historic flooding like a week before we got there. And we also held a rally. That's me with the bullhorn, the middle lower photo. We held a rally to call on to Biden because like literally a month before that, he had made his famous infrastructure bill speech there in Lake Charles. And from like, us going there and seeing like nothing had really been done. So we were calling on him to support the people of Lake Charles. And then the next day after that, we held a mutual aid food distribution drive to get fresh food and water to locals. From there, we did a whole bunch of other things. And when we got to Texas finally, in Beaumont, we walked the picket line in solidarity with locked out Exxon union workers and talked to them about the intersections of the climate crisis and how the Green New Deal could help oil and gas workers transition effectively into the new economy. And lastly, we ended in Houston. We did a whole bunch of things. We talked about social justice with Fifth Ward Circle Coalition, Circle Coalition, where we rode bikes and talked to the locals about their decade fight with Union Pacific, they've been going through a creosote crisis with like their soil and water. And we also did a storytelling event where we told about our stories from the march, and we talked about communities we saw that were being impacted disproportionately. And then lastly, we ended in front of our senator's house to call on to Biden once again to enact bold climate action through his infrastructure and reconciliation bills. Feel free to check out our website. This is for Sunrise Movement Texas, which I am a part of, and as well as our Facebooks and Instagrams. Thank you, John, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for giving me the floor.
Thank you so much for joining us, Shantae, and in some way really making an important link between Transition US and Sunrise. And certainly one of the common projects is to fight for a Green New Deal, a People's Green New Deal. And we value enormously what you and your comrades in Sunrise continue to do. So much appreciation. Next up will be Jules Bistrova, incidentally, one of the co-organizers of this extravaganza known as the Regenerative Community Summit. And we turn the talking stick over to you, Jules.
Actually, John, do you mind if Jess goes first? I'm in a noisy place and I'm trying to move out of it.
I don't mind at all, and neither does Jess, I imagine. I will then say that Jess Alvarez Parfrey is also one of the co-organizers of the summit and is comes from our EcoVista transition initiative, among many other places, and is a member of staff on Transition US. So over to you, Jess. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I just want to do a quick audio check. Can folks hear me okay? Great. I just wanted to send some appreciation and my utmost admiration to you, Shantae and Michelle. And again, thanks, John, for the invitation to speak. As John has mentioned, and like Michelle has presenced, I wear a lot of different hats. I occupy a lot of different spaces. And I think the point I'm really wanting to bring forward today with my time around this conversation of climate justice is how do we really ground these ideas on the everyday lived experiences of those that are at the front lines. And again, Michelle and Shantae have already spoken to this, but I think this is really critical when we're talking about transition. For folks who have been with us throughout the summit, we've had some amazing speakers. And we've also had some really important calls to reflection and recognition that our movement, in order to be a true representation of the work on the ground, is needing to be more diverse, is needing to show up in those spaces and places where folks are already showing their tremendous leadership and showing us the kinds of things that we need to be doing to ultimately heal our society and heal the planet. And I think this also connects to the point around jobs, or how we're trying to frame it within Transition US with our Regeneration Nation campaign, right livelihoods or regenerative livelihood. How do we make this guaranteed to every person in this country? So for me, social justice is an invocation to reflect on what we mean by humanity, what are human rights, and what are the obligations that we have towards each other and to the planet that sustains us. And I think it's important for me, like I come from a background in environmental studies. That's where I met Michelle at UCSB. We were both in that department. Yeah, environmental studies love. And what I loved about that program is that it allowed us to think in terms of systems and see that things are not separate buckets. They're all intimately interconnected and they will affect the outcome, right? So I think when we're thinking about the climate, we have to take into account that vast legacy, that history, that deep time history in terms of what it took for this planet to be able to even sustain life, okay? And so that guarantee towards life, that regenerative aspect of this earth that we share and hold in common, reminds us of how we need to be designing our societies and healing our culture so that it does provide for everyone's basic needs, and in fact allows them to thrive, not just survive in a world that seems to be careening out of control and headed towards chaos. So I think this is something that's really important. We actually touched on this on our previous session where we were talking about climate change and mental health and disaster, right? Like, how are we holding the responsibilities that we have towards one another when all things are telling us to look out for ourselves? And I'm also thinking about today, I don't know who else was affected by the outage of Facebook and Instagram. And I'll be honest, I complain about those platforms all the time. They represent for me so many things that I think are wrong with this world. And they allow me to connect with friends, with colleagues, with folks all over the world. And so when I see an outage like that and I see the disruption and the extraction that is possible, I also think about what would be the regenerative alternative that is equitable and that actually, supports that trend and tendency towards life and towards healing and towards care, as opposed to the alternative. So I actually want to keep my comments kind of brief, but that's what I wanted to bring forward. I also wanted to acknowledge some of the work very quickly before I turn it back that Transition US has been doing to really fully commit to having justice at the center of the work that we are doing in every aspect. So I want to acknowledge the Building Bridges work, of which Jewel Bystrova was a part of, where we were having really deep, important conversations about how do we heal together? How do we navigate a lot of the trauma, a lot of the injustice that keeps us fragmented and unable to see together? How do we make sure that those that are closest to the harm are also being centered and being held in a way that is respectful and acknowledging of their experiences in a good way? And I also want to reflect back that we're working more and more. And so the summit experience is super powerful, because we're only going to be able to succeed against this epic challenge of climate change if we fully come together and leverage all of our resources, all of our magic, and all of our experiences together. So again, another call to action and just gratitude for folks who are doing this work every day. Back to you, John.
Our gratitude to you, Jess, and I'm seeing lots of hearts and well-earned hearts, let's say. And also like to underline what's exciting about being part of Transition US now is to literally be living through a transition within the organization, within the framing of this movement. And the summit is both a token of that and will be a platform for launching that transition. So we want people to participate in the mighty, mighty network conversations that are available on this platform. To make connections, the kinds of connections that we're talking about, and to do organizing and to scheme up new, imaginative, collaborative projects together. That is my cue. We hope that the technology will permit us to bring to you in full Joel Bistrova, also Transition US at this time.
Yes, I'm here. Yay, thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you so much for holding this space. Thank you for all the voices that just came before me. And I'm live in Northern California, land of the Pomo. I'm currently traveling. You could probably tell I'm in my car. That was part of the issue I had here. And I'm really glad that Jess went before me, because I may not take my whole 5 minutes because she really covered a lot of ground. Mainly, I'm here just to really speak up for the work that we're trying to do right now in Transition US to make it much more reflective and expressive of climate justice work. I am a longtime transitioner. I've been with it since 2008. And I've been highly aware of climate change for longer than that, and been involved in all kinds of movement work, peace activist. But it wasn't until I went to Standing Rock, and since then have been deeply involved in lifting up and supporting and listening to and learning from Indigenous communities, that I have really gotten all the way through into my bones the need for bringing climate change issues together with justice issues, just like we are doing here in talking about climate justice. And at the time when I've been, doing divestment work, resistance work, super important. Transition's been for a long time about, community building, garden building, and resource sharing and skill sharing, and all really, really important stuff. But it's also been predominantly white, mainstream, middle class. Though I was still involved with transition, it occurred to me that I no longer felt like I fit in. I was looking for other movements that were more diverse. And a little voice told me, no, you got to stay with transition and help make it that way, because there's a lot here that we have that is really, really rich, and we need to evolve, and we need to just become a more diverse, more reflective of the solidarity that we all believe in, and bring in the divestment and the resistance work as well as the community building work. And so I did bring in the Building Bridges series last year, and we are currently working on a new series next year, a training series to integrate into kind of work on the ground, groups on the ground. It's interwoven with the inner resilience work that I'm also involved in, because there's so much healing that needs to happen between cultures, between races, diversity is important, but it's not easy. It's messy, it's hard, it's painful sometimes. And so the work of coming together and diversifying and it is also about healing trauma. It's also about acknowledging, you know, history, reconciliation, repair work. All these things are absolutely essential and vital in the work that we're doing. And so trying to really bring that in right now and make a voice for that. So that's why I'm here. And thank you, John, for the platform. And I will give you the piece back now.
Thank you, Jewel, Jess, Michelle, and Shantae for kicking this off so beautifully with your many voices. And we'd now like to open this into more of a still more multi-sided conversation by inviting folks who are watching in the audience to ask a question or make a comment or an observation. And easiest for me would be if you did use the raise your hand icon. And if that is not possible, then the chat, maybe in all caps, so I can see it that you'd like to speak, and we'll try to keep a stack for that. One thing we're going to do is not have a serial kind of Q&A response to each question individually. We're going to take all of your questions, or at least a good number of your questions for now, and have them all on the table for any of our panelists to address after that. The first hand I see is my friend Shakhtari.
Jumped in quickly. Thank you all for the work you're doing. And I'm thrilled that we're all gathered together to have this conversation. It's so vital. Shantae, my question is for you, but also everybody here, but I especially want to, I was in the middle of writing you separately 2 days ago and got tied up. So I'm so glad you're here. One of the things that I've noticed as being involved in the transition movement for so long is that we don't have a way of tracking our learnings over time, so that we're each individual transition initiative isn't having to reinvent the wheel each time. We learn stuff, but then each locale is different. So what works for one area doesn't necessarily work for another. So I've been holding a lot of conversations in this summit about creating some kind of a database that we can share broadly with all kinds of organizations. And so I want to invite you and the Sunrise organization to co-create that with us, and any other groups that you feel could utilize that information, and we could discuss it in more detail. I have plenty I can show you, but I'd love to initiate that. I dropped my email in the chat for you.
Thank you, Shakhtari. Shantae will have to remember that question and come back to it. And I also point out a second question for you, Shantae, from Tracy. I don't know if Tracy would like to unmute and vocalize that question.
Sure, pretty simple question really, but maybe an interesting answer. I was just wondering what kind of a reception you got from the ExxonMobil workers when you were there.
Okay. The concrete, the real stuff. Hopefully this format will work and it's not too strange to take questions and then circle back to our speakers. I wonder if there's anyone else with a question or comment for right now. I see you, Thea.
Hello, friends. I would like to hear what people think about engaging with the political system, because part of the peoplesparty.org organizer, and I wonder, like, how come we've all been, do we have Stockholm syndrome? Are we like a maladjusted to a bad situation? You know, our politics are so awful, and so if I ask you to do it, how do you feel? Does that make you feel like I'm asking you to do something awful? And how can we break that like logjam of us doing politics? Because, man, we can't let these people do it. The people in charge are just awful. So that's my question to our colleagues.
Thanks a lot, Theo. I'd like to recognize Giovanna, a name that I do recognize from the class, and I'd like to invite Giovanna to actually unmute and speak her question if she likes.
Yes, hi, thanks for having me. I was like wondering, because I know that the climate change right now is kind of a very hot topic between like people in different political parties, and I was wondering if you guys, what kind of barriers you guys, have to go against, and what you do, like in case of somebody that is, for example, anti or not doesn't believe they, because I was listening the other day somebody saying that some people think that climate change is a far left wing hoax, and we all know that it's not. Climate change is changing, we are accelerating that, and it's kind of getting bad as already is, and and sometimes I feel like we're trying to say something good and something and being attacked. And what do you do about that?
Beautiful, Giovanna. Thank you for that question. I actually saw Michelle's hand. Is that right, Michelle?
It was it was to Theo's question. I think I'm in a unique position to respond to that, but I know that we're going through a number of questions right now. So whenever
why don't we start a go round of replies before we take more questions? Is anyone else in the queue that I missed before we do that? All right. So over to you, Michelle, for the first entry in this go round.
Thanks, John. So to the, I'll take the opportunity to quickly respond to both questions, but I'd just like to allude to that I'm in a unique position to talk about engaging with the political system, or this, depending on the level of system. I have more experience speaking about state legislative work, specifically in California. I think that with the kind of position that I'm in, having one foot, really understanding where that system comes from, or at least having having that firsthand experience with the state legislative experience, as well as now being the network manager, I think that it is completely and totally exhausting. It is taxing. It is very bureaucratic. However, I think that it is a necessary part of the movement. It's not going to be the entire thing. I think that there is some general shared feelings. I'm not sure where I totally settle on it, but like the need to recognize that this system is stifling a lot of our voices, and that it is in its current form, the way that we create environmental policy can actually is more detrimental and takes a lot of time, and we don't have that kind of time when it comes to the climate crisis. With the IPCC's report, with the recent several months ago UNFCCC's report, like, we are losing time, and there's not really, I think it's becoming very apparent that we don't have the kind of luxury that a bureaucratic system would take. So I think there are, however, various measures at the state, federal, local level that we can do to hit, big oil and gas in their pockets. Speaking of divestment, and thank you, Jewel, for your work in divestment. Like, I was part of the Santa Barbara Standing Rock Coalition steering committee leadership, where we had the city of Santa Barbara divest $6 million from Dakota Access Pipeline funding banks. And it's that kind of immediate term impact that I think that local jurisdictions have, state and federal government systems have, that we should still leverage and use while we have a longer term strategy on making our society a more livable place. So that's my answer to the first question. Regarding barriers to speaking about climate change, I think that for the first 10 years of my career, from 13 to 23, and I'm 26 now, in that time period, I have been working at my local museum of natural history, where I was trained as a STEM researcher and educator, rather, an environmental educator, where I had to quickly learn at 13 years old how to pivot, and convey complex, concepts, ideas from astronomy to anthropology to botany to indigenous botany. And really adapt it to the audience. So, while there are going to be concessions, that there are going to be people who will just never listen to you, I think that's a skill set that could be fostered by anybody, is to not change your content, but to adapt it it's a skill set to adapt your education, your knowledge, your wisdom to the audience that you're speaking to, so it permeates. And so for the most part, by kind of meeting people where they're at halfway, without overexerting myself, I think that has helped with overcoming some of the barriers that otherwise would have been more challenging if I did not have that skill set or take the time to foster that.
Thanks, Michelle. Challenging, isn't it, to remember the questions? I know I haven't remembered the questions, but I do know that several were directed Shantae's way, and I would invite Shantae to speak next.
Thank you, John. First, I will thank Shatari for extending that. I would love to help with the database. We actually actively have one just with our movement regarding the whole project, with all the learnings that came up. It was a pretty diverse group. It was about 20 of us, and diverse all around, sexuality, gender, ability, disability, race, class, everything. We had a bunch of learnings I would love to, share and contribute. And as far as the second question, what kind of reception did you get from Exxon workers? Thank you, Tracy. Honestly, we had a bunch of different responses. There were some workers that were, open to like engaging in what I like to call generative conflict. And we found, like, personally with the worker I spoke to, his name was Chris. And we talked about climate change. First, he was kind of talking about how it was a hoax. And then I talked to him about how climate change was an economic issue. And then we were able to like struggle around there. And we made some leeway. And I was talking about like the Green New Deal, how like one of our main campaigns that we talked about during like our march was the Civilian Climate Corps that we were hoping for Biden to pass in his infrastructure bill. And I talked about just in 2017, Hurricane Harvey also hit Beaumont. And I was talking about, what if he was talking about how the community had to clean up after the storm. And I was telling him like, what if people were able to get paid for that? And so like I found like little like leeways to like generate some, meaningful conversations. But honestly, like some other people had different experiences than me, depending on what worker they had. So yeah, the reception was all around like different, but it was generally, we were there in solidarity, if anything. So it was pretty positive. There were just a few, things here and there. And also the other, what type of barriers do you guys have about speaking up about climate change? Personally, just with the way that we're taught in the movement for like canvassing and like bringing people into the movement and talking about climate change, we generally go for people who are in the middle, who are like have neutral feelings, or who like, know about climate change, but like are not sure what to do. They feel pretty desperate and hopeless. And then we'll say like, join the movement, like you can find ways to like, break through and create change. We do that. And then if I am talking to people who are like climate change is a hoax, one of my favorite tricks, I guess you can say, is that I like to convey it as a top bottom issue. So like, owning class, top 1%, and then like working class and everyone else. And how I really like to go for the more economic thing. It usually works for me, instead of a left-right issue. So that's just something I want to add. I think I got every question, if I remembered.
Thank you, Shantae. I'll invite Jewel and or Jess to respond as they like, if they like.
Yeah, I just have something, just a comment. it's interesting. I mean, climate change, trying to share about climate change hasn't been a big issue for me, except for within my family, which I actually have a brother that's voted for Trump and has that whole narrative. And so actually I don't even really bother to talk to him about it, but it did get me interested in deeper work around the bridging the divides type of work. There's an organization called Braver Angels, which is doing amazing work, bringing people together of different perspectives that believe in very different things and holding really sane and grounded conversations, debates, or whatever you want to call them, to bring understanding on both sides. And so I'm imagining they must have done one around climate change. I'm not sure, but anyway, that is one thing I wanted to say. And then the other thing I wanted to say was I found within, like, say, the transition movement and people kind of transition aligned kind of population, I found it interesting that even though most people, of course, believe and accept climate change, a lot of people, now it's changing, thank goodness, but a lot of people did not connect climate change to social justice very well, if at all, didn't see that connection. And so I think this is the next step that we're doing, is really helping people connect the dots. So that is taking a bit of work. And thank you, John, for doing that work too. Peace back.
Well, thank you, Jewel. Jess, you get to complete this round if you like.
Yeah, I'll jump in. With regards to politics, I also feel like I'm carrying some unique experience with regards to engaging with the political system. I actually did run for office in 2020, right before the pandemic fully hit and we were on lockdown. And that was a really, I'll be honest, stressful, slightly traumatic experience, but it was an immense learning opportunity. I was actually, quote unquote, disrupting a race. I received a lot of fear, a lot of, honestly, just really frustrating responses from folks in the community that I thought would be on board and understand why we needed more political disruption. And I think with a note on disruption, it's like the politics that we're used to, and like Theo, I think you were getting to this point, that we're so over, does not have to be the politics that we continue to practice. And then the question is, how do we get there? And I think that there's a lot of amazing scholarship coming from like the Black feminist tradition, a lot of folks in the global South who have, like, I don't have to spout new knowledge about it. We have to try different things, and we need to come together in an unprecedented kind of way. So rethinking governance, and this is an important phrase. If you're an organizer, I'm sure you've heard it. If you're not ready to govern, you're not ready to win. So I think that's something that we really need to do. Like, we're suffering, we're seeing the real-time effects of what it looks like to gaslight people over generations and to not give them access to the type of learning and respect and acknowledgement that they need to be fully productive and like responsible members of a society. We have been taught the lie that there's a pyramid and you got to scramble to the top, because that's the game and that's how it has to be. So I want to invite us again to rethink, reframe politics. A lot of amazing scholars have gone there. And I think running for office, like, I'll be real, we had, I don't know how many people running for office trying to recall Gavin Newsom. That was horrible. So the right has their way of engaging with it. We need to be smart and do need to have some kind of political strategy in place. Unfortunately, it's there, like Michelle was saying, like, we can't ignore it. And I think Emily Kawano really painted this well in the panel she was a part of. She's from the US Solidarity Economy Network. It's to our detriment to not engage with power. So we do need to grapple with power. And then with regards to the barriers around talking about climate change, I was actually, like a professional canvasser. I worked for Greenpeace. I worked all up and down the state of California. And I'll tell you this, like what Michelle, you shared about being able to reach people where they're at, is absolutely the case. Like, there were some days where folks were so happy to see me because, like, nobody gets me in my town. You guys are like, I'm with you. Thank you so much for what you do. And then other days, people would throw trash at us. I had a gun pulled on me while canvassing at one point. A full spectrum of humanity, right? There for you. But what you really realize is that people don't want to feel dumb. They don't want to feel like they're not capable of contributing to something good. And I think most people are kind of waiting for a call to be like, let's be better. Like, let's be better together. And like, let's figure this out. And that's where I was best able to reach folks, is when I made the space for that, instead of just jumping into a sales pitch of why they should donate money to a nonprofit. So I'll hand the piece back.
Thank you, Jess. And valuable experience. I remember that campaign very well, and a lot could be said about it. We all learned quite a lot, and I agree and feel that you carried a real weight on you during that, and you carried it really well. We're coming to the end of the first hour. I'm going to turn to Shakhtari, who is going to make the final comment in this round, and then we're going to take a brief bio break, I think. Okay, Shakhtari.
Very brief. I worked on the Department of Peace initiative, and people in my congressional district, I was in charge of the whole district, thought that peace was not patriotic. So that's what I was up against. And what I found was some incredible tools that helped me frame things so that we could have conversations. And if anybody wants me to share some of that, please let me know. Shakhtari@gmail.com. I'll be happy to share.
Well, thank you. And I'm now putting in the chat the plan. It is 6 minutes to 6. So let's take a nice 3-minute break. Don't go away and make dinner or what have you afterwards, but please come back, because we have 4 more speakers and the conversation becomes very global at that point, with speakers from England, India, South Africa, and the Philippines. So see you all at 5:57. Have a nice break.
Thank you.
We're back, everyone. In the second hour, as mentioned, there'll be another kind of panel go round. 3 of these presentations, the first 3 that you're about to hear, are pre-recorded for us, especially, and one hopes the technology will be kind to us. First, you're going to hear from Patrick Bond, one of my models and mentors as a scholar activist of the global climate justice movement. Patrick, based in South Africa and involved in so many organizations, both in South Africa and well beyond, and truly a member of the network of global climate activists in the world. And so let's see if we can share his clip. Here we go, I hope.
Hi, it's Patrick Bond here. My new base is the Department of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg. But it's great to be with you at UCAL, Center for Climate Justice, all our dear friends at UCSB, and all of you trying to work through what it is to fuse climate justice and social justice, which for me, towards eco-socialism, requires some dialectical tensions with ecological modernization. Allow me to explain where I'm going and look forward to your feedback. The long paper here, which I don't have time to more than scratch the surface of, will appear in Science and Society later in the year. And it partly follows from dialectical challenges by people I admire. The best known of these eco-socialist dialecticians I want to address is David Harvey, who was my PhD supervisor in the late 80s, early 90s at Johns Hopkins. And what David is trying to do in his 2020 book, The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, is not only come rather belatedly to address the need for cutting emissions, but as he says, we have to do more than that. There's an urgent problem to decrease existing concentrations of greenhouse gases. Now, the way that David Harvey suggests we address this is by getting the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and back underground, sequestering it. There are all manner of schemes. They're often called false solutions, aimed at exactly that, techno fixes. We won't go into them, but the paper does explore especially what kind might be nature-based, and especially address the potential for sequestering carbon in the soil. And I thank especially Fred Magdoff for some of his insights. But this quick presentation isn't to get into these sorts of details. it's to address a methodology. I learned this methodology when David, back in his 1996 book, Justice, Nature and the Geography of Difference, was setting out a challenge for the environmental justice movement, which was rather micro in its orientation, addressing localized problems. For David, that meant the need to organize production and distribution in general and confront the realities of global power politics and displace the hegemonic powers of capitalism. And that would require going beyond the dispersed, autonomous, localized, and essentially communitarian solutions, and instead adopt a more complex politics, recognizing how environmental and social justice should be sought by a rational ordering of activities at different scales. Planning, eco-socialism. Now, that rational ordering will require the EJ movements, they will have no option, to broaden out from the militant particularist base, in other words, the local struggles, and find a non-co-opted, non-perverted version of the theses of ecological modernization, which, as we'll see in a moment, really do entail complicated strategies for planning and managing the environment and society's relationship to it. Now, that means going beyond, or subsuming even, our cultural autonomy, our dispersion, our proliferation of tradition and difference, with a more global politics, and making, in the process, environmental and social justice central, not peripheral concerns. And that, in turn, will mean we should radicalize the ecological modernization discourse. I think the methodology for going about such a process is to really challenge ecological modernizationists. And I give some examples of how I think that can be done through all sorts of strategies of engaging in, for example, environmental impact assessments or means of changing cost-benefit analysis calculations so that the eco-socialist principles can really ring out in fights with neoliberals who would use ecological modernization not to plan, but to produce the capitalist modernization project. Now, let's find another concrete example of an ecological modernization approach we can all get behind. And for David Harvey, the method, again, is interesting because the dialectic, the contradiction internal to this example, is quite revealing. It's about refrigeration, long vital to human health for food supply. But the chlorofluorocarbons emitted in the process of the old form of refrigeration created an ozone hole which allowed ultraviolet rays to harm human populations. So we had to do something about CFCs. So we have, in 1987, a Montreal Protocol. That's the kind of approach that needs to be pursued. Well, what the problem here entailed was to acknowledge that the CFC emissions were expanding this hole at the Antarctic, and in the process set a precedent for solving a global pollution crisis with multilateral strategies, the United Nations being the core site. This is, I think, what we'd all like to see happen with the climate catastrophe, but we know the balance of forces won't allow it at present. In contrast to the climate crisis, the prior episode of planetary instability as a result of the capitalocene or anthropomorphic activity, that is the CFC emissions, was a banning of the production of CFCs that took effect in 1996. Now, the Montreal Protocol did ensure rapid emissions cuts, and as a result, from around 150, the level of ozone measured by Dobson units stabilized at 100. As a result, the ozone hole itself, which was increasing dramatically, also stabilized. There are other scholars and activists who work on dialectics as a way to generate better understandings and stronger strategies that rely, for example, on critique of root causes, understandings of dynamic pressures, thinking about impacts, and then working through resistance. Andreas Malm's 2020 book, Corona, Climate, and Chronic Emergency, is one example. And I found useful Andrew Jameson's work, The Making of Green Knowledge, to contrast how ecological modernization approaches that are dominant, especially in institutions of power, and environmental justice strategies that are usually adopted by the powerless, have a potential for a dialectical resolution, at least temporarily, in an eco-socialist approach. The paper explores how these modes, the types of agency, forms of actions, and knowledge sources might work out. And finally, the main message, I think, coming from this dialectical work is to think big. Helena Sheehan has worked on Friedrich Engel's dialectics of nature and finds that the natural sciences were on the point of a crisis in which there are two choices: the reign of chaos and incoherence, or the achievement of order and coherence through dialectical synthesis. I think that's the challenge that we face, addressing the climate catastrophe with something stronger and broader than what we've developed so far in climate justice. And I think that's a dialectic in a debate with ecological modernization driving to eco-socialism. What do you think?
I think it's always good to allow one professor into a session like this, and I want to thank Patrick, who couldn't be here, but who will be watching this recording, and who will welcome any comments, questions, thoughts you have for that presentation. Our next recorded presenter is Mitzi Jonel Tan, who hails from the Philippines and is an activist in the Fridays for Future movement in the Philippines chapter of that. And she has recorded for us the following. Let me try to stop that. Okay, that's nice, but that is not what we're looking for. And I just need to turn that off. Here's Mitzi. And here we go, Mitzi.
Hey everyone, I'm Mitzi Jonel Tan, a climate justice activist based in Metro Manila, Philippines, and I organize with Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, which is basically the Fridays for Future of my country, and with Fridays for Future MAPA, which is Most Affected Peoples and Areas, which is right now the global south arm of Fridays for Future, and with the Fridays for Future International. So a lot of our work in the Philippines really revolves around raising awareness about the climate crisis, which is a curious thing if you want to think about it, because the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to the climate crisis, yet there's so much lack of awareness around it. So if you ask people, and surveys have actually said that people know that they're impacted by climate change, but they don't know what that means. They don't have enough awareness around the implications of climate change, because if you have the privilege of being educated around climate, just like I was, the way that they taught you was that it was about the melting ice caps, the polar bears, and those are all very important, but not about how the typhoons that I was growing up with was already the climate crisis. The way that education was built was very foreign and technical and alienating and not empowering at all. And the answers were all about reducing, reducing, recycling, all about individualist change and not empowering us to really understand and be critical of the systems in place that have caused the climate crisis. It didn't talk about the fossil fuel industry at all. It didn't talk about the multinational companies. It didn't talk about the over-extraction of the global north of the global south's resources and the system that has brought us to this climate crisis. So a lot of our campaigns here in the Philippines really talks about what are the roots of the climate crisis, and really understanding how to address the climate crisis means understanding its roots. And for us, the roots are really so tied to this imperialist capitalist system that has really changed the way that we view ourselves and nature. And it's not just ourselves, really. If you look at it, so many indigenous peoples and small farmers and small fishing communities and our cultures before the colonizers came was so in tune with nature. Like there's no Filipino language for crash and things like this. Like our language, it reflects how in tune we were with nature, that we have so many words to describe our relationship with nature. And then the colonizers came, and suddenly there's this group of people who is above other people of color and above nature. Suddenly there was a disconnect. Suddenly we weren't one community, we weren't one ecosystem. There was something above that could take advantage of and extract and exploit the other. And that's really where a lot of the climate crisis stems from, that imbalance between our views of nature and ourselves as humans, because that imbalance serves a greater purpose of profit. So it's really how, these global north leaders and the multinational companies, they're doing this for profit. And we have to talk about how that plays even until today. It's not just a thing of the past where there was colonialism, but now it's fine, we're good. There is still neocolonialism that's very alive and present. So an example of that is how our laws are in English here in the Philippines, but really how science is so kept away from the people and people don't understand it. Like science in general, and what more the climate science, that's so confusing to understand and figure out. Then you also see how, so that's our culture, and then you also see how our economics are so dependent on the global north, because we can't even create we can't even create like the tip of this pen nib. Can you see it? We can't even have that in our own country. We have all the resources to create it, but we can't make it ourselves. And so what happens when finally the fossil fuel industry is dying out and the world is mandated to transition into renewable energy? What happens to the global south countries that can't industrialize yet? Because we don't have the capacity to do that, because the global north has kept us dependent on them, so that we're forced to give them our cheap natural resources and cheap labor, right? So will what happened with the vaccines and COVID today happen with renewable energy, where we go into debt to try to get the things that we need to survive? The patents, the intellectual property rights, all of this coming together, really. Another really clear example of that new colonialist nature is how majority of climate finance is in the form of loans and not grants. So the global north gives us climate finance or aid, and they think it's helping, in the form of loans, and then we go into debt for the climate crisis impacts that they cause. So there's so much wrong in that thinking, yet it's not talked about enough. And really one concrete way to start going towards reparations is canceling debt, because it's not aid, it's not climate finance, it's a responsibility, and seeing it as a solidarity fund, as something that the global north is doing to help the poor, helpless global south, just continues that system that has brought us to the climate crisis, the one where there are people, there are countries, there are, the rich people are above everyone else. And you can really see how the intersections of the climate crisis are so apparent. So I don't think I have to say this and reiterate it, because I'm sure so many have already said it before, but all the other socioeconomic crises are amplified by the climate crisis, and the climate crisis amplifies that. And if that is something that you don't understand yet or fully see yet, I really encourage you to go outside of your bubble and look for the stories online that really show this, because that's what activism and really people should be about. It's about decentering ourselves and actively seeking out the voices of the more marginalized and listening to them, because their stories are so full of resistance, and there is so much to learn from them. There's so much to look up to, and there's so much to support and to amplify, and that's really what we should be doing. Fighting for a world and fighting for a system that doesn't leave anyone behind. That's really what all that we're asking for. When we call for climate justice, it's basically figuring out how to get rid of this system that's so profit-oriented and so focused on capital accumulation and the everlasting growth of the global north and the overexploitation of the global south, to one that cares about community, to one that cares about people, to one that cares about the planet. And that's not difficult. It shouldn't be, because it sounds great for everyone, right? So why is it being phrased as something that seems so radical to think of it like this? Why is it radical to think that the end of capitalism is the solution to the climate crisis? It's not. It's not radical. It is the answer. This is the system that brought us to the climate crisis. These injustices brought us to the climate crisis. This same system won't be able to get us out of it. And how do we solve that? How do we get rid of this system? It really starts with listening to the people who are most marginalized, because they have the answers. It starts with supporting the on-ground campaigns in the global south and stopping imperialist plunder. It starts with reparation. It all just starts there, and then we're gonna keep learning together and we're gonna figure out how to get there. But I'm sure that we will get there, because we're only joining the struggle of our workers and our fishing communities and our peasants and our farmers and our indigenous peoples, and they're already so strong. And then you remember that there is someone on every country fighting for climate justice. We might not all have the same definitions yet, but that's what we're doing now today, really talking about the intersections of the climate crisis and how the solution to it does not lie in the same system that brought us to it. And I'm sure that even though it sounds so scary and overwhelming, and I'm not saying it's going to be easy or fast, I'm sure that we will get there, because another world is possible. We are unstoppable.
Thank you, Mitzi. Interesting to kind of listen to the deep connections in what Mitzi was talking about and what Patrick was talking about. I know so many amazing climate activists from the Philippines, to mention a few: Walden Bello, one of the strongest critics of that unequal global system; Yeb Sanyo, who gave a speech at the UN climate negotiations in Warsaw in 2013 that reduced the crowd to tears, because the day before the negotiations began, a superstorm, a cyclone, had hit the Philippines and devastated communities, including where members of his family lived whom he couldn't reach. And Lidi Nakpil, another tireless networker on the global level, who connects labor and environment and North-South issues. Our tour continues to the United Kingdom, and we have words recorded for us by Rupert Reed, a professor, and one of the co-founding forces behind Extinction Rebellion, which burst onto the scene in the fall of 2018, at the same time that the Strike for Climate did, the Fridays for Future movement, and shortly to be followed by the Sunrise movement. So something was happening, something was in the air at that time, just before the pandemic hit. Interesting food for thought. Let's see if we can find Rupert and make the technology work once again. There we go.
I'm not able to be with you in person because it is literally the middle of the night where I am. But this is Rupert Reed, wanting to join you virtually and make a short contribution on the theme of your important event. And really, there's two things that I want to say. Firstly, in relation to the concept of justice here, I want to urge us to fully include intergenerational justice, which is a key part of my philosophical work. It's easy for us to see the terrible injustices, the terrible inequalities that rack our world in the present. And hugely, hugely important, and obviously you'll be talking a lot about this, to seek to remedy those. It's harder to see the intergenerational injustices that are in progress. The reason for that, of course, is that we cannot see the future until it is present. So my view is that the high likelihood, this view is justified in, for example, my recent book with Jem Bendell, Deep Adaptation, there is a high likelihood that this century will see a climate decline which is so severe that it degrades the conditions for civilization. The best option, I think, is that we manage to achieve some kind of transition and transformative adaptation. I'll talk about that more in a moment. But I think us managing to achieve that without civilizational collapses will be very, very difficult. Anyway, even if things are not quite as bad as I envisage, what you can be certain of is that the historic so-called progress of human civilization over the past century will be in large measure coming to a close within the lifetimes of many of us. Material growth in GDP, etc., will not be continuing for most of the world for very much longer. There is going to be a huge, challenging transition to go through. And what any of these scenarios mean is that there are ways in which our children, and probably even more so our children's children, are going to be challenged much more than most of us have been. And I mean that even for those who are struggling right now across much of the global south. So, I want to urge you, I'm sure many of you are doing this, I know many of you are doing this, I want to urge you in your work, in what you're trying to achieve, in the way that you think about and argue for the kind of futures we ought to be creating, to place intergenerational care and intergenerational justice centrally in that work. If you want to know more about how I envisage that, then check out my book, Parents for a Future. The second thing I want to say something to you about is transformational adaptation, or as I call it, transformative adaptation, because if there is going to be any future, that's going to be a key part of how we get there. Deep adaptation, preparation for potential societal collapse, is now vital because we cannot any longer rule out that civilizational collapse is coming. But transformative adaptation, which puts the emphasis slightly more positively on system change that could yet prevent a collapse, or at least an uncontrolled collapse, is, in my opinion, just as important. The two should, in fact, be integrated. I discuss this with Jem Bendell in our book, Deep Adaptation. And transformative adaptation is going to be a key wave of the future and a key wave of the 2020s. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the defining struggle of the 2020s will be to define adaptation. Does adaptation get defined as incremental defensive adaptation, as it has traditionally been done, insofar as any attention has been paid to it at all? Does it get defined as geoengineering, as putting up mirrors to block out the sun's light, etc., all the other crazy things that some of the well-funded want to do? Or does it get defined as deep adaptation and transformative adaptation, as system change that works with nature rather than against nature, as a change to our food systems and everything else that prepares us for and takes seriously the nowness and the comingness of the crisis that we are inhabiting and will be inhabiting permanently for the rest of our lives. That is a defining struggle of the 2020s. If adaptation gets defined as defensive adaptation and geoengineering, we're finished in such a dire way. If it gets defined as transformative and deep adaptation, then we're in with a real chance. On this front, I want to urge on you the wonderful work of the Glacier Trust, of my colleagues in the Transformative Adaptation Collective, and of the Climate Emergency Centres movement that is now burgeoning, which is part of the transformative adaptation effort. Transformative adaptation, a concept that of course began in the UN, has had its existence in the academic world, runs through the book produced by the think tank I used to chair, Greenhouse, the book Facing Up to Climate Reality, and is now taking form more and more out there in the world. This is an absolutely vital part of what we need now if the aims of your event here today are to have any chance of being achieved. So, colleagues and friends, so sorry not to be with you. I hope those two little interventions connected, obviously, are of help. Intergenerational justice, transformative adaptation. I hope these will be key themes in your discussions and in your hugely important work.
Thank you, Rupert. I don't know if you could hear the skies burst open. A huge thunderclap. We don't usually have thunderstorms in Santa Barbara, California, and now we really are getting the first rain of the rainy season. Very welcome rain, which you'll hear on the roof here. Those are our 3 recorded presentations. I'm so grateful for each of those individuals to do this for us. And I am now looking for my friend and comrade, Shrishti, whom I do not see in the room. Shrishti is in a number of organizations in India, a relatively young activist in what's called the Global Tapestry of Alternatives. Wow, that rain is loud. I imagine you can hear it. And when she comes, we'll give her the floor. So let's again open up until she comes for questions and observations from the floor. I'm happy to recognize folks that raise their hands and or get my attention in some other way. It is raining hard here. I don't show it, but I'm very excited. I don't know who lives in a semi-arid part of the country or world, but that's our reality here. California is in an unprecedented, yet another unprecedented drought of many years. Everything depends on water in terms of what happens in the western part of the United States, as in Australia, as in the Middle East, as in many parts of many countries in the world. I want to also point out the obvious from the presentations that we've heard today already, that there's an explosion, a kind of efflorescence, a blossoming going on now in many corners of the world today. And just to express my gratitude to the amazing people that I've met over the last dozen years who are doing this work, folks in the global climate justice movement, as you know, folks in transition, folks in all of the social justice movements. It's when you meet somebody, there's an immediate connection, and you're meeting somebody who brings a richness of experience. And the sharing of that is what makes the work so rewarding in itself. It's hard work, but yes, you meet amazing people, and it's fun to do. We have to make it fun. We have to make it creative. I'm thinking of the Art of This Evening last Friday, which was just that. And that's an important part of sort of the new ways of doing things in social and climate justice movements. So I'm just riffing here, waiting for questions or thoughts, and hoping that Shrishti got the correct link to the session. So I'm going to check my email. And if there aren't questions, I did find one other short video just made that I've been sharing with my students, also underlines the youthfulness, the global scope, the creativity of this event. And I intended to share it with you at the end of the session. So I'm going to show this if I can find it right now. And hopefully you will enjoy that if I can find it. Give me one moment. So, oh yes. Sorry, I have to go to the document and get the link. Here it is. Meanwhile, enjoy the sound of paint on the roof here. You can hear it. Okay. So I'm going to stop. There's going to be a commercial. I apologize for this intrusion of a commercial into our summit. And I'm still looking. This is called Young Climate Feminists Building Radical Futures, and you'll see that it's a work of art in itself. Here we go. Sorry about this commercial.
To a cozy Verbo mountain cabin with a kitchen where everyone can chef. But the
climate crisis is raging all around us. From wildfires to hurricanes and oil spills, we're witnessing the devastating effects of centuries of extraction and harm at the hands of colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. But through systemic analyses and by grasping at the roots of injustice, young climate feminists are challenging the violent systems that shape our current realities, building and imagining transformative futures that center radical care, community, hope, and liberation.
When we dream, we don't always make it out of the perimeter of ideas from an industrial anthropocentric era. I dream of forests and rivers being restored, of rewilding, letting nature recover from extractivism. I imagine the exciting freedom for everyone to not worry about healthcare or food or water. Redistributing wealth and resources and creating amazing universal safety nets would give our next generation something greater than the limited dreams of mansions and yachts or colonizing another planet. We could have real joy.
To imagine radical futures is to break out of systems that constrain us. Now, when political and economic structures serve only the few and multiple crises are felt at once, envisioning a world beyond capitalism is revolutionary. How will it be when we transition from fossil fuels, start to honor the diversity of bodies, and humans and non-humans live in harmony with their ecosystems? For these futures to exist, we must heal from exploitation through collective care, centering those that have endured the impacts of violence.
We're still going to need activists and resistance movements in the future. So many women, queer folk, BIPOC communities, and allies resist for liberation in all its myriad forms. We must decriminalize this work and support water protectors, those pushing to defund the police, people challenging borders, people resisting eviction, and folk radically reimagining the future. This is justice work to build abolitionist ecologies. We must protect and honor these healers, troublemakers, and freedom fighters in our feminist future.
I see a world where marginalized women and gender-oppressed people are able to seek accountability, demand countries' historical responsibilities and restitution for violation of rights they have experienced, where indigenous women are able to speak out when their forests and sea are destroyed and their right to free, prior, and informed consent is ignored. I want a future where economies work for the women and not women working for the economy.
I want a world in which all the relations that violence has severed are reconnected. A world which is free from violence in its many, many forms, whether it's physical, sexual, the violence of forms of work and labor, or the violence of being denied our basic rights. A future where we can all breathe, where we can all eat, where we can thrive and live. Our relationship to nature, which capitalism has worked so hard to destroy, will be restored. A future where the violence that is so often perpetrated upon women's bodies and upon land is gone, and in its place, consent in all its forms.
Imagining and building radical feminist futures is not an exercise in utopian fantasy. It's a critical systems thinking approach. It grounds us in knowing another world is possible. We can and must achieve a peaceful, just, and healthy planet for all. As young climate feminists, hope is a political act. And as so many have shown us, hope is also a discipline. Practicing it is hard work. We maintain hope because we know this is the radical feminist future we need.
My job is to make college easier because students.
Hang on, folks. Zoom always challenges me, as it enables so many voices to come together in a given space. I did Shrishti, and I haven't been able to check my email. Here's what I would propose, though, if it's agreeable to folks, is to give you some space to think and talk together in a breakout space, maybe the next 10 minutes, and set up breakout rooms of maybe three or so people each, and allow you to have opportunities about what you've been listening to and what you've been thinking with each other. So let's try that. Oh, I have to do some things. Yes, like options, 10 minutes. Good. I think it'll work. Here we go. Have a good time together. Make it happen. Welcome back, all you smiling faces. I hope that those were good spaces for conversations and for meeting each other, which is how these movements are built. We are in the final quarter hour. I really feel for Shrishti, who was going to get up at 6 in the morning in India to be with us halfway around the world. Happened to me once or twice that I got confounded by time zones, including a talk that I was giving in front of a whole bunch of people, just me in Sweden, that I didn't show up for. But they very kindly understood, as we understand. And this is the final space altogether. And I'll leave the space open for folks to offer their reflections as we kind of move toward closure. And of course, I'll reserve a few minutes at the end for our speakers who are here to give their reflections on the session and beyond. So just get our attention and unmute and share with us.
I'd like to just jump in real quick. Given the stated goal, and I applaud the goal of Transition US to expand, diversify, become not such a white organization, there are links in the chat at 9:36 that I put to a number of social justice organizations that are Black-led, and I recommend that Transition forge formal alliances, public alliances with these groups, including ones that are pursuing reparations, which I hope Transition will support. Thank you.
That's beautiful, Sarah. And where are you joining us from?
I'm in New Jersey.
A hotbed of the future that we're all looking for. Thank you. Thanks for that. And please, everyone, I imagine between us, we represent a number of organizations and institutions and have various kinds of access to all kinds of resources. And why not use that to put links to those things? I'm going to go with a couple of PDFs of books and put at least one in the chat, a book called Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, which some of the people around Trish T helped put together 2 years ago, which consists of 70 short chapters on a whole set of systemic alternative ideas from around the world, from buen vivir to eco-socialism to Ubuntu to the commons to radical ecological justice. And it's a rich space in which to learn about what's happening around the world and make those connections that way. It's very easy to read in a sense and very engaging. And I'm going to go find the PDF for that and share it with you as a gift to everyone because it's a free book now. I'm just going to let folks unmute and say their piece while I go get that. Imagine that.
Don't everybody talk at once now.
I want to say that as an older person who has been working on peace and justice and climate issues for much of my life, that it's easy. We were in a breakout group with some students, and there just seems some hopelessness. And we have to look at the people who are here and let them give us hope. And the people who are at this summit, who there are more than 1,000 people who have registered for this summit. They're all working on the same issues. And we've heard from people around the world, and they're all working on these issues as well. And that has grown, and that gives me hope. And that I don't get into despair because I see all the good things that are happening. That doesn't mean that I don't recognize the crisis that we're in, but that we need each other, and we need each other to support one another and give hope to one another.
And I'd like to acknowledge your enormous contributions to the organizing of this summit as the person facilitating the organizing committee and running all those meetings. I won't call them endless meetings, but there were many meetings. And much learning went on among us in that process of trying to figure out what would be a good program, who would be, you know, a great speaker for a particular panel, what themes should we go after and try to make happen here. The whole film series, for example, the morning inner resilience, you can wake up to that at, I think it's AM. I've never been to one because I teach at 8 AM. And the lunch and learns around midday. In addition to these workshops and plenary.
I see Theo's got his hand up.
Thank you, Rua. Over to you, Theo. And we're going to have a final go round of Jess, Jewel, Shantae, Michelle as well after Theo, perhaps. So hang on.
I'm just going to chime in and invite us to do a little land acknowledgement as we close our circle here. Reminding us, you know, we do this transition U.S. work on Turtle Island. This is colonized land, and we're grateful to be here, standing with our indigenous allies. We know the Line 3 pipeline is going to turn on this week, and it's going to be a huge defeat to our Native allies who opposed it. So prayers up to them. Please support frontline organizations with donations. Those are poor people who opposed it, and they kind of turned in their homework, 100% nonviolent opposition to the pipeline. So praise God. And that's all I want to say. Thank you guys so much for being here. Well, we really have fought for the world we deserve tonight, and I appreciate you all so much.
Thank you, Theo. Turning the floor over to the four folks who began this conversation with us. See what they can channel at the end of it. I'm looking at you, Michelle. You went first. What do you make of all this?
That each of us have, it just continues to astound me, the kind of collective wisdom and love that we have for each other. And it is one of the most gratifying experiences to continue to be in these spaces with each and every one of you, some for the first time together and some for however many times that we continue to work together. And I look forward to the many opportunities forward to work with you. You know, my manager email is open to you all, and some final thoughts as I continue to be emotional. Because today is the 4th of October, and I think about some of the, one of the things that really rang home for me in a previous speaker was the, was to think about intergenerational justice and to borrow from fellow islander wisdom, while not Filipino, Hawaiian, that for those of you who don't know the background of this phrase of 7 generations, that at any one point, each of us are going to continue or interact with 7 generations. The ancestors before you who you have never met, your grandparents, your parents, yourself, your children, and the children who come after you that you will never meet. And at any one point, each of us are working for all 7 and keep 7 in mind. And for me personally, always thinking about my great-grandmother who is still with us, oh gosh, miraculously, and getting closer to her 105th birthday in December 5th. So I think of her, I think of a lot as her health is failing her and her body gives way to move on to the next world, that she and the ancestors before me and the children after are the biggest reasons why I continue to be drawn to this work. So thank you all for sharing this space with me. It is truly an honor to learn from all of you.